In the summer of 1944, the world had reached a breaking point. For 5 long years, Europe had been a continent on fire. Cities reduced to rubble, empires collapsing, and millions of souls caught in the storm of a war that seemed without end. But behind the thunder of guns and the roar of engines, there were quieter sounds too. The scratch of pencils, the hum of factories, the murmurs in war rooms where men in uniforms drew lines that would decide the fate of nations. Among them stood Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, a man whose mind worked like a machine, efficient, cold, and calculating. He wasn't a general. He didn't command troops or tanks, but his influence was colossal. He was the man who kept the Nazi war machine alive when everything else was falling apart. And yet, by August 1944, even Albert Speer began to see what few around Hitler dared to admit, that Germany had already lost the war. It was a bright, suffocating morning in East Prussia. Speer was standing at the edge of a massive airfield, a sea of steel and dust. Before him stretched row after row of American Sherman tanks, tens of thousands of them, lined up like metallic beasts ready to devour everything in their path. Captured intelligence photographs had been brought to him, aerial shots showing endless formations of these tanks, rolling off Allied production lines. 50,000 Sherman tanks. 50,000! Speer stared at the images in disbelief. He knew the numbers. He had read the reports from the front. But until that moment, he hadn't felt the scale, the sheer industrial power the Allies had unleashed. Germany, he realized, could never match that. At that point, the Reich's factories were operating at full capacity. Thousands of workers, men, women, even children, labored day and night in underground facilities, building tanks, planes and rockets under relentless Allied bombing. And still, it wasn't enough. Each week, Allied production dwarfed German output by an unimaginable margin. For every Tiger tank that rolled out of a German factory, the Allies produced 10 Shermans. For every Luftwaffe fighter plane shot down, 2 new Mustangs or Thunderbolts took to the sky. Speer understood the numbers better than anyone. He had built an empire of efficiency, streamlining production, centralizing resources, creating one of the most advanced industrial networks in history. But numbers don't lie, and as he stared at those photographs, one truth echoed through his mind like a verdict. Germany's defeat was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. Still, the regime refused to see it. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the Wolfslair, denial was law. Officers brought in reports of miraculous weapons, the so-called Wunderwaffe, secret technologies that would supposedly turn the tide of war. Jet fighters, long-range rockets, and invisible submarine were whispered about as if they were divine salvation. But Speer knew better. He knew the numbers, the materials, the deadlines, and he knew that none of it could save them anymore. Germany was running out of fuel, out of steel, out of time. What they still had was a dictator who refused to wake from his dream. And that dream was costing millions of lives. By August 1944, the Allies had landed in Normandy. Their advance through France was unstoppable. Paris was liberated. The Red Army was closing in from the east, devouring what was left of the Wehrmacht in Poland and the Baltics. Inside Berlin, fear began to whisper through the corridors of power. Speer watched as panic spread, as Nazi officials began quietly sending their families to safety, as officers who once shouted about glory now spoke in hushed tones about the end. And still, Hitler refused to yield. Speer's loyalty was complicated. He had built his entire career, his entire identity, around serving the Führer. To him, Hitler was not just a leader, he was a symbol of destiny. But now, Speer saw what destiny really looked like. It looked like 1,000 burning cities, a broken nation, and endless graves stretching to the horizon. In his diaries, Speer would later write that it was August 1944 when he truly understood the finality of their situation. That moment, standing before the evidence of Allied industrial might, was when his faith finally cracked. He saw that war was not won by genius, by speeches, or even by courage. It was won by steel, fuel, and numbers. And Germany had none left. Yet Speer didn't stop. He couldn't. He was trapped in a system that devoured loyalty and punished honesty. If he spoke the truth, he'd be branded a traitor. So, he continued the charade, overseeing production, signing orders, pretending that victory was still possible, even as the world around him burned. Every day became an act of denial, a performance for a doomed regime. Factories kept running, trains kept moving, workers kept dying, all for a cause that no longer existed. But behind closed doors, Speer began planning something else, something unthinkable. He started making quiet moves to sabotage parts of the German war effort. Not enough to draw suspicion, but enough to slow the madness. Because in his heart, he knew that continuing the fight would only mean more destruction, more death, more Germany reduced to ashes. This internal conflict between his loyalty to Hitler and his growing sense of guilt would define him for the rest of his life. He was both the enabler and the reluctant witness of catastrophe, the architect of war, and later, the architect of regret. By the time 1945 arrived, Speer's factories were collapsing. Allied bombers had destroyed entire cities. Fuel reserves were gone, and yet the orders kept coming from Berlin to build more, to fight harder, to never surrender. Speer, standing amid the ruins of his own creation, could see the truth more clearly than ever. The Reich he helped build was dying, consumed by the very fire it had unleashed on the world. He once told his staff, quietly, that history would not remember them as heroes or patriots. It would remember them as the engineers of destruction. As the war dragged into its final months, Speer's relationship with Hitler began to fracture. He started speaking more openly about the futility of continued resistance. He warned that the total destruction of Germany would serve no purpose. But Hitler, increasingly paranoid and delusional, refused to listen. He spoke of scorched earth, of destroying everything, so that the victors would inherit nothing. He ordered the Nero Decree, commanding that all German infrastructure, factories, bridges, power plants, be destroyed as the Allies advanced. Speer was horrified. He knew this would doom millions of innocent civilians to starvation and chaos. So, for the first time, he made a choice that could cost him his life. He secretly defied Hitler's orders. He told regional commanders to ignore the decree, to protect their cities, not destroy them. In that moment, Speer stopped being just an engineer of war. He became, in a quiet, understated way, a savior of what little remained of Germany's soul. And yet, when the war finally ended, when Hitler was gone and the Reich lay in ruins, Albert Speer faced the reckoning he could never avoid. At Nuremberg, he stood among the architects of destruction, men who had shaped history through blood and terror. He admitted guilt. He said he was responsible for enabling a monster. But even then, he tried to draw a line, claiming he hadn't known everything, that he wasn't part of the worst atrocities. History would debate that forever.
Was he truly remorseful, or just clever enough to survive?
But the truth remains this. In August 1944, when Albert Speer saw those 50,000 Sherman tanks, he knew the end had already come. The war was lost, the dream had died, and all that remained was to watch the empire crumble, piece by piece, bomb by bomb, lie by lie. Because in the end, wars aren't just lost on battlefields. They're lost in the hearts of the men who realize, too late, that their cause was built on sand. By early 1945, Germany had become a country of ghosts. The once proud cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, were nothing more than smoldering ruins. The rivers were choked with debris, the train lines twisted and broken. Millions wandered without homes, searching for food, for family, for hope that no longer existed. And yet, inside his office in Berlin,
Albert Speer still sat at his desk, surrounded by blueprints, maps, and endless files marked urgent.
the war was over in all but name, but Hitler refused to accept it. His orders became more delusional with each passing day. Hold every inch, build new fortifications, launch a counterattack. Speer followed these orders in public, but in secret, he had begun a quiet rebellion, a rebellion of silence, of small, deliberate disobedience. He had seen the reports. The Western Front had collapsed. The Eastern Front was a nightmare. The Red Army had crossed the Oder. Berlin was next. And yet, Hitler still ranted in his bunker about miracle weapons. The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the super tanks that would, he believed, reverse the war overnight. But Speer knew the truth. The fuel was gone, the materials exhausted, the factories buried under rubble. What they had now were dreams and ashes. Still, Speer continued his quiet sabotage.
He slowed production schedules, rerouted supplies, lost important documents in bureaucratic labyrinths.
It was his way of resisting a madman, not with guns, but with delays.
Every minute he bought saved another bridge from destruction, another city from fire, another life from senseless death. In March 1945, Speer traveled to Berlin for one final meeting with Hitler. By then, the city was barely standing. The streets were filled with rubble. The air smelled of smoke and decay, and the people, those who were left, moved like shadows. When Speer entered the Führer bunker, he was struck by the smell, a thick mix of oil, dust, and fear. Hitler was sitting at his desk, trembling, his eyes glassy and sunken. The once commanding voice was now a whisper, broken by rage and delusion. Speer tried to reason with him, told him the truth, that Germany was destroyed, that there was no point in continuing. He begged him to spare what was left of the country, but Hitler refused. He ordered the Nero decree,
the total destruction of all German infrastructure. Factories, bridges, power plants, all were to be blown up to prevent the Allies from using them. To Hitler, if he couldn't have Germany, then no one would. Speer left that meeting, pale and silent. He knew what he had to do, and he knew the risk. If Hitler found out, he'd be executed instantly. But for once, Albert Speer wasn't afraid. He sent coded messages across the country, instructing local commanders and engineers to ignore Hitler's orders. He told them to protect their towns, to save what they could. He appealed not as a Nazi minister, but as a German. And somehow, miraculously, many listened. They defied the Führer, quietly, secretly. And when the Allies arrived, much of Germany's infrastructure remained intact. It was one of the few acts of mercy in those final, hellish weeks. As April 1945 came, the world closed in on Berlin.
Soviet artillery thundered from the east. American bombers filled the sky. The city was a furnace of chaos. Inside the bunker, Hitler was surrounded by lies, officers feeding him fake reports, promising armies that didn't exist. And Albert Speer, standing among them, could no longer pretend. He knew this was the end. He later wrote that during those days, he felt as if he were living inside a dream slowly dissolving into nightmare. Every face he saw was hollow, every voice trembling with disbelief. The Reich had turned into a mausoleum, and its leader, a man already dead inside. When Hitler finally took his own life, on April 30th, 1945, Speer was not in the bunker. He was miles away, standing in a shattered office, staring at a burning map of Europe. The man who had once built cathedrals of steel for the Nazi war machine now stood among ashes. The war was over, but his reckoning had just begun. At Nuremberg, Speer stood before the world as one of the 24 major war criminals. He was calm, collected, almost too calm. Unlike the others, he admitted partial guilt. He called himself the responsible technocrat, the man who had built Hitler's war machine, but who claimed to have been blind to its crimes. The judges listened, the world watched, and historians still argue to this day. Was he truly remorseful, or simply the most intelligent man in the room, crafting a story that would save his life? He escaped the gallows. He was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. In those 20 years, Speer wrote endlessly. He wrote about architecture, about the war, about Hitler. He painted himself as a man trapped by loyalty, blinded by ambition. His memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, became a bestseller, a chilling look into the machinery of dictatorship. But beneath his words, something darker lingered. He had not been a bystander. He had built the system that allowed millions to die. His guilt was not just personal, it was structural, industrial, national. He was the architect of destruction, literally. Albert Speer died in 1981 in a small hotel room in London, far from the ruins he once commanded. Some say he found peace. Others say he never truly escaped the shadow of what he'd done. But his story remains one of history's most haunting contradictions. A man who built cathedrals for a dictator, who gave structure to madness, and who in the final days tried to undo his own work, as if redemption could be assembled from the wreckage of a nation. The story of Albert Speer is not just the story of one man. It is the story of how intellect can become a weapon, of how genius, when married to blind loyalty, can create unimaginable horror, and of how even those who recognize their sins too late cannot escape their consequences. He was a man who saw 50,000 Sherman tanks and understood in that moment that everything he believed in was doomed. A man who helped build the Reich and then tried to save its ruins. A man who lived long enough to realize that history never forgets. Because in the end, the greatest tragedy of Albert Speer's life was not that he lost the war. It was that he finally understood it. And by then, it was far too late. And as the echoes of history fade, remember this. Every empire, no matter how powerful, is built on choices. Some create, some destroy. Albert Speer's story reminds us that knowledge without conscience can build wonders and ruin worlds. If this journey through the hidden corridors of World War II moved you, then stay with us. There are still untold stories waiting, stories buried in forgotten documents, whispers from the past that shaped our world. Subscribe now and join me as we uncover the next unseen chapter of the Second World War. because history doesn't end in the past. It waits for those who dare to look closer